Well, welcome back, everybody. And thank you very much for joining this next panel, which is really going to be focused on the question of emerging risk and social inflation. With us today is Robert Revelle, who is the CEO of Predicat, now a Moody's company. And he will be talking to us about how he's been using tools and capabilities to understand and to identify emerging risk, what that all basically means, and how it informs the insurance community around perhaps pricing, certainly around the legal liability issues that are sitting out there. And what Robert will do is drive his presentation on his side. So, and of course, Jasmine is here as part of this discussion as well. Jasmine again is at Marsh. I'm at USC and Aon, and so welcome, Bob, to the discussion at the CPCU Insurance Day. Thanks so much for being here. Now, by the way, everybody, I'm in Hawaii. Jasmine's in LA. No, she's in San Francisco, and Bob's in Bermuda. So we're covering as many time frames as we can in one fell swoop. So, Bob, thank you so very, very much. So, Bob, please introduce yourself in terms of what introduce Predicat, introduce what's happening with Moody's, introduce the basic concept of your business.
Sure. Thank you, Ward, and hello, Jasmine, and thank you to all of you for joining us today. So I'm Bob Reville, and as Ward said, I'm the CEO of Predicat. Predicat is a liability emerging risk analytics company. So emerging risks cover a lot of different things for different parts of the industry. So I'm specifically focused on liability and casualty. And so, more than anything else, the liability and casualty risk issues that we deal with are large scale litigation, things like the forever chemicals and Roundup and talc litigation. And those are the kinds of things we're going to talk about, all going back to asbestos litigation, which, as it turns out, was the largest single loss in insurance history at over $100 billion. It's the kinds of things that might hit casualty insurance in the future that Predicat focuses on. And we're based in Los Angeles, and though we recently were acquired by Moody's, and so we're at a very exciting stage for Predicat, where Moody's has enormous amount of data assets that they're wanting to bring to bear to help solve casualty problems for insurers, and they brought us in to help launch it. And so yeah, we're moving into a new phase. No longer a startup, and now
Yep.
part of a big modeling and analytics company.
Yeah, so you've gone through the cycle and survived it. That's great. Educationally, you're an economist.
Exactly. I'm a economist, a labor economist in particular. And even though I am not in an academic institution doing economics, I used to be at the Rand Corporation where I was an economist before we started Predicat. And the type of modeling that we do at Predicat is trying to understand what is driving trends in litigation, what's causing particular litigations to start and grow, and how large can they become. And as it turns out, similar to how in cat modeling meteorologists or seismologists are important, being an economist is really useful for understanding what's happening in casualty.
Right. And you did your degree at Brown, is that right?
Exactly. Brown
Very
University,
good. Yep.
PhD.
Yep. So let's pull up your slides because you've got some really cool things to talk about.
Okay, let me get this going. All right. Can everybody?
Yes, we can.
Okay, let me get that on.
And for those of you, if you have questions and we're in a position to answer them, please put them into the chat box and we'll do the best we can. If we can't answer them today in this live session, we'll certainly record them and get back to you after the sessions have been done.
So I'm going to start by talking about what's happening right now, 2024. And again, casualty emerging risk means what are the things that are happening that might be causing large scale losses for casualty insurers. And the last the last 10 years or so, let's say 2016 to 2022, those 8 years, we entered into a very challenging time for casualty insurers. Prior to 2016, new large-scale litigations or mass torts were happening at the rate of, let's say, one or two every 10 years. Back in the 80s, there was a bunch of environmental litigation and there was asbestos. In the late 90s, early 2000s, there was a bunch of pharmaceutical litigation. And over the 2000 or from 2000 through about 2015, we were in a very quiet period. And starting in 2016, suddenly the world changed. And what was a once in 10-year event suddenly became a once a year event. And we saw the emergence of one new mass litigation after another with Roundup and talc and repetitive head injury and acetaminophen causing autism and the forever chemicals. And I'm just listing off some. There are still many, many others. And then in 2023, it all stopped. And there were no new mass torts that started in 2023. And so far in 2024, there have been no new mass torts again. And so what's going on here? I should note, first of all, litigation that began prior to 2022 continues to work its way through claims and build up as litigation. It's just new claims, new mass litigation starting. And the other thing that happened in 2022, though, was interest rates went up. They had been very low for a very long time. And that low interest rate environment caused there to be a growth in interest in highly risky but high return assets. And out of that grew an entirely new asset class that's called litigation finance. In litigation finance, you have capital, or let's say investors who are investing in various ways in lawsuits. They are, and it takes many different forms. It takes the form of perhaps um, sometimes it could be loans to plaintiffs. Sometimes it's loans to law firms to help them to buy advertising to recruit plaintiffs. Sometimes it's actually securitizing actual bundles of claims and then buying a share of all of those claims and getting a return on the upside. It's become over 2016 through 2022 a fairly sophisticated market that is diversifying for investors and relatively high return. And it is I don't know if the USC endowment is invested in litigation finance, but I have heard the Harvard endowment is invested in litigation finance. There are publicly traded litigation finance firms in the London Stock Exchange. It's a whole new world, and it's all money that is flowing into plaintiffs' attorneys to pursue litigation against companies. So that is a world where now, from what I understand, 20 to 30 billion dollars in assets under management that has caused, in my view, you could say has caused what people call social inflation in all of its various forms. And yet, despite all that, 2023, 2024, the activity causing new mass torts slowed from a fairly frequent event to zero. And the interest rate increases can explain that. When interest rates go up from, effectively 0% up to above 5%, all of a sudden these highly risky litigation funding assets are no longer as attractive. And capital flowed out of litigation funding. You see, I quote something from Wellfleet Advisors saying that there was a 14% decrease in funding in 2023. We don't know what happened in 2024, but we have been told there's been a decrease over that time period as well. And what funding continues to be made is flowing into existing litigation rather than trying the risky thing of trying something new. So that's one part of the environment. What's going to happen in 2025? Interest rates are now falling again. Are we going to enter a world where we're going to see new mass torts emerging? We'll see. But I think actually, Ward, maybe I answered the question of what an economist is doing looking at casualty insurance. But that's the current state of
Well,
what's happening this year.
you actually answered it more directly than a typical economist would, because if, some of us would have been approached with the same question, we would have said, well, it depends.
Yeah,
You know,
exactly right. No, I gave an answer,
yeah,
right?
actually gave an answer, which was great.
Um, so just to say that nothing started in the last 2 years doesn't mean that there isn't a lot going on. You get 8 years of new mass torts starting, and you've got a lot of litigation working its way through the system. And the number one, I think if casualty underwriters, exposure managers, uh, brokers, I think you would hear most people agreeing that the number one casualty emerging risk for the last few years has been the forever chemicals. The forever chemicals, for those of you who don't know what they are, per and polyfluoral alkyl substances. They are used in a wide range of things from Teflon pans to Gore-Tex and other types of waterproof clothing to I'll talk about some of the other applications. It has wide industrial use. I'll note also food packaging, cosmetics. And the problem with them is that once they're produced, there's no natural version of them. Once they're produced, they stay in the environment for everywhere forever. I mean, forever. And then you just need to think we started producing these things back in the 70s, and every year we're making tons and tons of a chemical that stays in the environment forever. And so you're just adding more and more accumulation in the environment. And then in the last 10 years, scientists have come to understand that not only are we getting more and more in the environment, but it actually causes bodily injury when it gets into our body and it's contaminating our water supply. And so starting in the last few years, you've seen this emerge into a major litigation against the companies who are involved in producing, using, and selling these products. So, what Predicat does is, we work with insurers to help them to understand their exposure to it. We work with underwriters to help them to understand how to manage it as they underwrite it, whether to apply exclusions, whether to try to change the triggers involved in it, whatever else they might be doing, and then we try and estimate the potential losses. So I'll give you some numbers today. Our estimate for what the expected losses from PFAS are going to be ultimately based upon all production that has happened since the 70s through today is that it will result in $80 billion in losses, though it could result in losses at 1% probability as high as over $200 billion in losses, which would make it bigger than asbestos, which would make it the biggest single loss in insurance history. That's why people are worried about it. We're facing that potential outcome for the forever chemicals. So, how does this break down? 65, I should know, by the way, just talk about some real numbers about real companies. 3M had an $11 billion PFAS water contamination settlement last year. So big losses. So we estimate 65 billion of that 80 billion is going to be from water contamination litigation. And we estimate 16 billion of it will be from bodily injury litigation. PFAS has been tied to a range of bodily injuries, including a number of cancers, such as testicular cancer. That's a prominent one that it's involved in litigation over. One of the really most prominent areas involves firefighting foam. It's used in firefighting foam, and then the firefighting foam is runoff. It's often used on military bases, and then uh, again, you use the firefighting foam. The chemicals in that firefighting foam are going to stay in the environment forever, so it runs off into the local water supply, and then people are drinking it, and you're finding contamination around air bases, military bases, airports, etc. And you're also finding elevated rates of testicular cancer among people who are exposed to firefighting foam or drinking the water supply in the proximity to the air bases. So that's where the litigation comes from. But again, firefighting foam is only one thing. What happened last year in the litigation? There were states attorneys general who got involved in litigation. This is something that happens in modern litigation. It's not just individuals bringing cases, but states bring cases on behalf of the citizens of the state. The first such litigation that worked that way was tobacco litigation. But since that time, it's become a common way in which litigation unfolds. The most recent of them was the opioids litigation, which happened in this 2015 to 2023 window. And that one was, I don't have the exact numbers at my fingertips, but 65, $70 billion litigation, almost entirely driven by states attorneys general. Not mostly not insured, mostly borne by the um, pharmaceutical companies and the distributors and retailers for those products. The retailers and the distributors, though, they did have insurance, and so it ended up on the insurance industry's balance sheets as a result of that. Um, so we've seen $17 billion paid to date. 3,928 cases were filed with PFAS as part of the cause of action last year. That was the largest single amount of such cases in any year since the litigation, since the beginning. Oh, our insurers, how our underwriters to think about this problem? I have to say, this is a big problem. And I'm going to kind of put this in perspective for you by talking about a recent article in a journal called The Science of the Total Environment. Now, what is really, really tricky about PFAS is we're not talking about a chemical that was banned in 1978. We're talking about a chemical that continues to be produced in large volume today. So those numbers I gave you, $80 billion, that is for production to date. But this article on the science of the total environment, they were trying to answer a different question. They said, our numbers are only water contamination. They said, let's look at how much is produced of one class of PFAS chemicals. How much is produced this year? And how much will it cost to completely remove that from the environment? Not just from water, but from soil, from air, from everywhere. And the number they came up with for this year's production of one kind of PFAS was between 20 trillion and $7,000 trillion. So my numbers for the litigation are for things that happened in the past. This is what's continuing to happen. And where is it happening? It's happening in pulp and paper and metal finishing and textiles and personal care products. And I'm going to talk about a couple other industries that are interesting. Lithium battery production uses PFAS chemicals. Semiconductor manufacturing uses PFAS chemicals. Um, you know, the clean energy transition requires lithium battery production. Bringing manufacturing back to the United States requires semiconductor manufacturing. How do we balance the need as insurers to solve our clients' problems and also protect ourselves when our clients need protection from these types of risks? So this is not this is not, we can't just go out and we can't continue to sell a useful product and go out and have widespread exclusions. We've got to be more creative about it. We've got to deploy useful underwriting strategies. Maybe I'm just going into, technical details here. Maybe somebody who's doing something with the forever chemicals should not be able to buy insurance on the occurrence form that will pay claims 30 years from now. But they still need claims made or integrated occurrence or something like that. And the insurers themselves need to monitor their aggregations and set appetites just like they do for hurricanes in Florida. And they need to think carefully about exclusion language and where to apply it. In some cases, it might be reasonable if they're still writing 3M to put in place a PFAS exclusion. But do they want to put an exclusion in place for semiconductor manufacturing where there's been no claims yet and there may not be claims for years, and the companies need protection? And then what kind of reinsurance might be available to them? There may be creative ways to reinsure these risks, such as runoff, which is an emerging reinsurance market. That's PFAS. Ward, should I move to the next, or did you want to stop and jump in?
No, that's good. Go to the next one, but as you jump into the next discussion, you might want to very briefly describe how you use AI tools to comb the scientific literature to identify these emerging risks and start looking at what the potential litigation probabilities look like.
Sure. Yeah, great. By all means. So I'm going to talk a little bit about addictive software design. And that is another major new litigation that actually started in 2012. And addictive software design litigation, the way we look at it at Predicat is all of these new litigations emerge out of science. And so in order to be successful in suing Meta because your daughter suffers from severe depression as a result of exposure to social media, there has to be a scientific literature connecting social media to teenage depression. And it has to be a relatively mature uh, scientific literature, or else you won't be able to establish causation in the litigation. What Predicat does is we use AI tools to mine the scientific literature to find at the earliest possible stage where there is a chemical or a product or a business activity that scientists are concerned might be causing bodily injury or environmental damage or latent property damage. And when there's maybe 3 or 4 or 5 studies in the literature, then it's too small to really result in any litigation. And so it provides a great early warning system for insurers to start to think about what might be coming down the pike, what might they have to worry about, what might the underwriters have a good dialogue with risk managers about. Um, those, in some cases, those first 3, 4, 5 studies become 10 studies or 50 studies or 100 studies. There's over 100 studies with social media and teenage depression. And once it gets to a certain point, it's rich enough that it starts to become part of the public dialogue. A plaintiff's attorney, possibly funded with some litigation funding, is going to start to advertise to find some clients, and the litigation will begin. All along that time, we are tracking the literature, understanding the exposures involved, creating an estimate of the industrial footprint, and then we have an additional set of tools, which is probabilistic loss modeling that we use to estimate what the economic loss is associated with each one of these new claims that they might be and who might end up paying them. And we turn that all into a system that underwriters can use. They can go in and they can look up 3M and they could see, in fact, they could have seen in 2013 when they looked up 3M, before the litigation even began, that PFAS was top of the list. And the goal is to get the underwriters to understand that before the litigation begins. So we actually started talking about with our clients about addictive software design in 2019 when we first started seeing the literature beginning to get critical mass around the idea that there was a growing crisis in teenage depression and that it might be tied to the use of social media. And between 2019 and 2022, the American Pediatric Association came out with a warning that there was a crisis in teenage depression and said in the warning that it was likely tied to social media. And so in 2022, this litigation started. Um, to date, there have been no settlements, and there are some challenging issues in the litigation. The defense have a lot of arguments for other things that might be causing this trend. There's also a lot of really bad evidence against them, I have to say. I'm just going to give my own personal opinion here. Um, there is evidence, that they knew they were designing products that were going to create a dopamine spike that made people want to continue to use the product, and they knew that children were more likely to be affected by these dopamine spikes, and they knew they didn't have in place adequate ways to necessarily monitor this. I don't know. I hope what I'm saying is not this, these are controversial statements. They will all be litigated. As of this time, none of this has reached a jury.
The
Uh,
interesting thing, though, Robert, is that for those companies that are producing these software products, their general liability coverages have become extraordinarily complicated. And the carriers are expressing significant concern over how do we actually underwrite this when
mm,
we already have clinical evidence around some of these issues. It's now a question of are we approaching critical mass when this turns into something very, very different. So the marketplace has certainly picked up on the question. And the problem for these companies, though, is they still have to operate.
yeah,
So what do they do? I
right.
know
No,
you have a slide. You have a slide later on this issue, but there are a couple of other updates here that are really important for this audience to hear. But this one is very troubling because almost everybody in this audience has a brother or a sister or a child and it doesn't matter who you are in the population. This particular design issue is impacting them,
mhm.
and it's every day. So it's going to be very, very interesting. But I will say the insurance market has taken notice, and they're trying to figure out pricing, not
Yeah.
always successfully.
I would like to take maybe a little bit of credit for the fact that the industry has noticed, because I do think we've been working with our clients who are
Yeah,
a lot of the big insurers around trying to understand this risk. But we do take an approach of we want we recognize this is a critical product for a lot of companies, and it's a dialogue that has to happen between the insurers and their customers, and their knee-jerk reaction to try to exclude the risk is rarely the right answer.
yeah, yeah.
Um, so one other quick comment that's been very interesting in this litigation is that there's been 550 cases with school districts as plaintiffs, which is a totally new thing. The school districts, on trying to be compensated for the increased educational expenses associated with dealing with the crisis of teenage depression. Um, so, and we also, there's a couple areas that are not yet in the litigation, except a few cases, online gaming, video games, and the potential for various deployments of AI. Um, as an underwriter, looking at AI, the question is not, is AI bad or is AI good? AI is just a technology which might be bad or good depending upon what it's used for. But if the business that you are underwriting is following a business model that may not result in alignment with the interests of the users, than you or may end up addicting the users, such as perhaps maybe it creates personalities that are so engaging that people will spend too much time with them. Thinking a few steps downstream about what that might result in is useful as an underwriter.
Yeah, I think there was a movie made about that, wasn't there?
I think there was, yes,
Yeah,
exactly,
there
right.
you
Um, okay. Let's talk a little bit about phthalates. I know we got 10 more minutes, right? Um, so the last the last mass tort to start, I should note on this slide, the last mass tort to start in 2022 was hair relaxer litigation. And I didn't put that on this slide. Sorry about that. The hair relaxer litigation emerged out of a scientific literature that was finding that that women, uh, mostly African American women, who are frequent users of hair relaxers have elevated levels of uterine cancer. And again, another, I'll just say, kind of uncomfortable fact pattern, where the hair relaxers are put on the scalp and then they can burn the scalp a little bit, the story is, and as a result, it makes the skin more likely to be penetrable by the underlying chemicals in the hair relaxers. And so it gets into the blood or into the brain, and then has resulted in these elevated levels of cancer. Um, that case has taken off with, very quick pace. 10,000 cases already, 125 defendants. The one, two, and three, Revlon, L'Oreal, and Soft Sheen. Um, Interestingly about the litigation, not a lot of cases, not a lot of science around hair relaxers causing cancer, handful of studies. The plaintiffs' attorneys are aware of this, and the complaints in the cases, they are arguing that it's not the hair relaxers per se, it's the ingredients. And they focused in on one particular ingredient, which is the phthalates. Phthalates are a very large production chemical, and the phthalates are used in a huge range of things. I list some here: toys, medical products, building products, etc. These days, a lot of buzz around the phthalates. Um, they are now being called the everywhere chemicals because they're used in so many things. And then they're contrasted with forever chemicals. So the everywhere chemicals do not stay in the environment forever, but they're used in so many things that people are exposed to them. If you are exposed at particular, with enough frequency or at particular points in development, they can cause health effects. They are what's called an endocrine disruptor. So endocrine disruptors are more likely to result in things like uterine cancers, which are reproductive cancers. Anything that involves, well, I mean, they're also involved in testicular cancer, infertility, a range of things. Um, the question is, will the hair relaxer litigation become everywhere chemical litigation? We have estimates for how large it could be if it does become everywhere chemical litigation, but that remains to be seen. I'm going to talk a little bit about microplastics. So I've talked about litigations at various stage of emergence. Microplastic litigation is not yet emerged. I tend to be very cautious in these kinds of presentations to predict that there will be litigation when the litigation has not yet started. The whole idea of predicate, though, is that we believe that there is a predictor that comes from the rate of growth of the scientific literature for whether or not litigation will start. And since we have been doing this, no scientific literature has grown as quickly as the microplastics literature. 8 years ago, the first studies started to come out that were finding that, oh, gee, there's a lot of plastic in the oceans, and what does this mean? And these always the plastics they break down, and what happens? Well, they get picked up by weather, and they end up coming down in rain, and that microplastics are in the soil. They're in the Arctic. They're everywhere. Wait a second, microplastics, they're actually in our bodies, and last year they're in our brains. Um, Microplastics are everywhere. And the science has started to say, well, what happens when they get in our bodies? And they're finding that they may have health effects. But just to give you a sense of this literature, um, I mentioned there's a couple hundred articles, or something between 100 and 200 articles on social media and teenage depression. There's 15,000 articles on how microplastics are impacting the environment and our bodies. 5,000 we estimate by the end of this year alone. How that will not result in litigation, I don't know. And so we are looking at, there are some cases that are out there that are not bodily injury and they're not property damage, and so they're not insured yet. And so the insurance industry doesn't see them yet. There's been 64 such cases, consumer cases, greenwashing cases, a number of different things, three of them brought by public entities. Among them, just to give you a sense of where the defendants might end up being, Procter and Gamble, Coca-Cola, those are some of the potential defendants. None of that should surprise you when you think about it. Coca-Cola clearly involved in producing plastic bottles and selling them, for many, many years. What is an insurer to do with that set of that information? What Predicate's doing is we're really digging into this issue. We're trying to understand where might litigation start first. And so the scientific literature is increasingly looking at specific microplastics. So, for instance, you see the picture here is our one of our analytics that model the consensus around causation for specific hypotheses in scientific literatures. And what's looking at in this case is micropolystyrene. So that's the breakdown product in the environment from styrofoam cups. So that's a specific chemical with a bunch of specific commercial applications. And as you can see, the science is taking off for its potential to cause bodily injury. But we can know better as insurers where that's likely to show up. And so how do you approach that? First of all, as granular as possible, estimate your accumulations and set your underwriting appetites. When you're setting your underwriting appetites, consider what, underwriting strategies you might want to do. Public forum. So I won't say, specific recommendations here, but maybe if you're writing on an occurrence form and it's one of the key obvious defendants, and you don't want to have 20 years of potential litigation, years of litigation to deal with down the road, you want to move them to claims made or integrated occurrence. That's a good example of an underwriting strategy. Can you find runoff opportunities from reinsurers? Maybe there are ways in which to write creative reinsurance products around this for specialists who are thinking about how to manage the exposure down the road. And in the short run, you continuing to take on more of this risk, you should be thinking about what it means for pricing. So,
So
um,
in the minute that we have left, really, any final thoughts that this group, who are CPCU individuals, they're in the underwriting cycle, they're thinking about these issues. Maybe several of them are a little worried right now about some of the books they're working with. But the point is, any final thoughts on your part about how people should be thinking about these emerging risk questions?
Yeah, my final thought on this would be to the underwriters in the room, you're in an exciting position. You could think to yourself that you're afraid of all this information because it's coming at you and your professional role. But if you arm yourself with the science and take the appropriate actions in the underwriting process to signal to your customers that you're concerned about this risk, that you've got to restrict their coverage, you've got to increase the price because they're doing something that causes damage, you send signals into that market that they have to change their production processes or they have to reformulate their products or whatever it might be. You're part of the solution. And that's an exciting place to be. Armed with science, underwriters are the solution to these problems.
Excellent. Well, Robert and Jasmine, thank you both for being on this session. Robert, I think you've given people a lot to think about, and more importantly, you've backed it with the science. You've backed it with what's showing up in the literature base. That's different in many ways. That's good, solid evidence. So with that, again, thank you so very, very much for being part of the CPCU 2024 Insurance Day. This has been an impactful discussion. With
Thanks.
that, we're going to be taking a break and coming back at the bottom of the hour, I believe, to deal with the issue of awards for all of you out there that have done something remarkable. So with that, we're signing off. Ed Coombs, back to you.